Assalamualaikum viewers, and welcome to the fifth episode of ISO 9001 2015 series. I would like to make an advance apology that during this session as well I will not be discussing about the ISO 9001 clauses. In last two episodes I have promised that in the next episode I will be discussing about the specific clauses of ISO 9001. But unfortunately, I will not be discussing the clauses even in this episode. I was planning to discuss clauses in this episode, but something came in my mind which is really important for all of you to know. So I believe that before I discuss about those specific clauses, I should go into the details of little bit of background of ISO 9001 and the history of 9001 from 1987 to 2015, because sometimes whatever changes happens during this period, they may impact on your understanding about those requirements which are available in the latest version of this particular document. So we will be discussing about the history of ISO 9001 today from 87 to 2015. And if you think that it will be a time wasting exercise, it will be a time wasting activity, so this episode is not for you. You can switch it off now and you can join me in the next episode where I will be discussing about ISO 9001 clauses. One more thing, I'm sure that you must have been bored with my white color shirt, so today I have changed the color, so hope you like it. Alright, so let's start from 1987. The journey of ISO 9001 started from 1987 when ISO organization TC 176, which is the Technical Committee 176, responsible for quality management system. This technical committee, basically it was formed long time back in 1971, and they were made responsible for quality management system. But from 1971 to 1987, they didn't come up with the quality management system standard. And in 1987, the technical committee adopted the British standard, which was at that time BS 5750, known as EN 29000 at that point of time in European Union, and that standard was adopted as ISO 9001 1987 version. So when it was adopted from the British standard, there were hardly any changes made in the standard. It was adopted on as-is basis. There were some minor modifications done within the British standard, and it was converted into ISO 9001. Remember, at that point of time, ISO 9000 was not officially claimed to be based upon process approach or risk-based thinking, although the components were approximately the same, but the standard was not declaring anywhere that this particular standard, this particular philosophy is based upon process approach or risk-based thinking. So process approach was later introduced in year 2000 when a standard came up with the second modification, and then finally in 2015 the risk-based thinking was also introduced. In 1987, when the first time ISO 9001 was published, there were three standards at the beginning: 9001, 9002 and 9003. 9001 was the most comprehensive standard. It was having total 20 clauses and it was covering the full organizational operations. Especially, it was targeting those organizations which are involved in design and development. 9002 was having only a minor difference from 9001. There was only one clause which was missing in 9002, and that clause was 4.4, design and development. So that means if the organization is involved in design and development, they were implementing ISO 9001, and the organizations which were not involved in design and development, they were going for ISO 9002. ISO 9003 was rather having a smaller scope. It was only for those organizations which were involved in inspections and testings. So limited clauses of this particular document, they were applicable to those organizations which were involved only in inspection and testing. So almost 12 clauses were applicable in that particular document. So 9003 was limited to very few organizations which were implementing inspections and testings. So that was the initial setup. Three standards, similar content, but one standard was having all the clauses, 20 clauses. One clause was deducted and they created another document. Doesn't make sense, but it was there like that. One clause was deleted, one clause was deducted, and they converted into another standard which was ISO 9002. And then 8 clauses were deducted from there to make it more relevant to inspection and testing organizations. So ISO 9003 was created. So this particular structure remained there from 1987 to year 2000. Normally what happens whenever ISO come up with any standard, in the first revision they don't go for major changes. So even if major changes are identified in between, they will leave it for the next revision. So by following this philosophy, in 1987 a standard was published. In 1994, when the revision came up, it was having very minor modifications from 1987 version. Only couple of clauses were touched, and even in those clauses not many changes were made. As far as I am concerned, as far as I remember, I believe there were two main changes at that point of time. Previously in 1987 version, standard was talking about document control. So in 1994 version, they talked about document and data control. So they included data into it. And then secondly, previously standard was only talking about corrective action. So in 1994 version, they came up with corrective and preventive actions. When I entered into this profession in 1997, the world was following the ISO 9001 1994 version, and 1994 version was basically promoting a lot of documentation. That concept of documentation came from the British standard BS 5750. It was adopted in 1987 version, and that was carried forward to 1994 version. So when I entered into the market, we were basically preaching throughout our career that documentation is one of the most important requirement of ISO 9001. So we were preaching about documentation. We were telling people how important documentation is. But at the same time, around the globe, a misconception developed at that point of time, and that was ISO 9000 is merely focusing on documentation. Why I use the word misconception? Because that's not really true. ISO was not only talking about documentation. ISO was expecting you to establish and implement an effective management system. And at the same time, ISO believed at that point of time that documentation is extremely important to make sure effectiveness of your management system. But generally in the market, a misconception created that ISO only talks about documentation, because every single clause, almost, there were 20 clauses, almost every single clause was talking about a mandatory documented procedure. Contract review was one of the clauses, and contract review was requiring a documented procedure. Training was one of the clauses. Training was requiring a documented procedure. Statistical technique was one of the clauses. Statistical technique was requiring a documented procedure. Identification and traceability was one of the clauses. It was requiring a documented procedure. Inspection and test status was a clause, and it was requiring a documented procedure. So almost every single clause was requiring a documented procedure. So in early 90s, this concept was created around the globe that ISO 9001 is having too much focus on documentation, and ISO is only about documentation. Although it was a wrong concept, although it was not correct, but definitely when something is available at very large scale, then you cannot deny it. So ISO organization had to do something about it, and that's what they did. They came up with major changes in 2000 version, and suddenly in 2000 versions they slashed many of the mandatory procedures. From 13-14 mandatory procedures, they reduced it up to 6 only. And interestingly, later on they even removed those 6 procedures as well. In fact, they were not left with any choice. Because of this large scale misconception, they had to do something, and they changed their focus from documentation towards implementation. But at the same time, when they were reducing the mandatory documentation from ISO 9001, they introduced a new concept of process approach in 2000. But unfortunately, people noticed one thing and they didn't notice the other thing. People noticed that ISO 9001 is reducing the requirement of documentation slowly and gradually, going up to the 0 level of documentation. But at the same time, they did not realize that ISO has introduced process approach. Why it is important to realize both the things at the same time? Because the process approach ensures that the right level of documentation is established and maintained within the organization. So if you are understanding one change and you are not really focusing on the other change, in totality you are missing out something. So according to the process approach, as I told you earlier in my previous lectures, that according to the process approach, you will identify the process You will identify what are the potential risk related to this process. You will identify what outcome you require and what are the requirements related to the outcome, and you will establish your own controls. The moment I say you will establish your own control, that means you will think about documentation, you will think about procedures, you will think about work instructions, you will think about job descriptions, you will think about forms and formats, you will think about some softwares, you will think about many other physical controls. So it doesn't really matter in the presence of process approach that ISO whether specifically demands documented procedure for something or it doesn't really demand a documented procedure for something. You will be deciding about those documented procedures and records, and you will establish an effective management system. But how people took it? People took it like ISO is trying to reduce the level of documentation. And during every second audit, when auditor was asking about the documentation, the auditee was saying, no, it is not specifically required by ISO 9001 standard. I remember I performed one third-party audit in year 2000. And the company was Asphalt Manufacturing Company. When I went to that particular company, I asked them about the procedures, and they said, we don't have any procedures. We just have these 6 procedures, corrective actions, preventive actions, internal audit. So these 6 procedures are established, but not any other procedures or any other thing related to the actual process, the asphalt manufacturing process. That was not maintained. And when I insisted that those are the extremely important processes, why you don't have any procedures and why you don't have any documentation for those processes, the asphalt manufacturing itself, the asphalt testing itself, the asphalt delivery itself, why you don't have anything related to any documents related to those processes? The answer was very simple. It is not required by ISO 9001 standard. During the audits, you don't get that much time to clarify these things to the auditee. During the audit, you don't get enough time to explain and provide enough awareness to the auditee. So the auditor's hands are tied up. So keep in mind, when ISO 9000 is not giving you mandatory requirements related to documentation, it doesn't really mean that documentation is not important, because process approach is gifted to you, and process approach requires you to assess your processes and identify the need of documentation. So you are the best people to decide what procedures are required, what work instructions are required, what job descriptions are required, what forms and formats are required. So after the introduction of process approach and later the risk-based thinking, ISO didn't feel the need to specifically demand for any documented procedures, because this responsibility is shifted from ISO organization to your shoulders. You have to decide what procedures, what documents, what records you should establish.